Welcome to the Q&A segment with Kaleb Leonard. If you were not familiar, Kaleb, he came to Chapel Grove, 2 weeks ago maybe. We had a young speakers meeting, and you presented on the subject of slavery, the Bible and slavery. And we gave you a pretty big topic, but we appreciate you coming back because we told people if you have questions, please submit those. And so that's what we're doing today, is addressing some of those questions in the Q&A segment. So appreciate you coming back, Kaleb. I know that you put a lot of time into the studies for this, and so I'm looking forward to what you have to say on some of these hard-hitting questions that people have thrown at you. I know we gave you a big topic, so when you say slavery in the Bible, you're not able to cover the whole Bible on slavery, and maybe some people, they might have heard your presentation, and they might have thought, well, man, he didn't say anything about this or anything about that. In fact, somebody came to me and said, well, he didn't really touch on this. I have a question. So if you are one of those people, and maybe even something that's not even covered in this Q&A, just understand it's a pretty big topic. And I'll give you the opportunity at the end of this to recommend any reading materials or anywhere people might go to get kind of the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, on this subject. So we'll just get right into it. We have, I think, 3 questions specifically, and we'll get into number 1 right now. So the first question that was asked to me was, did God use slavery as a way by foreign nations? So let me say it again. Did God use slavery by nations like Persia and Babylon to humble Israel and lead them back to God?
Yeah, I touched on this just briefly at the beginning of my thoughts at Chapel Grove. Talked about how in Exodus we kind of meet the nation of Israel for the first time. They've grown from the 12 sons of Israel all the way to the 12 tribes of Israel now, and they are in captivity in Egypt. And then later on in their history, when they kind of fell away from God and the prophets are trying to draw them back to God, they again experience captivity with Persia and Babylon and Assyria, and that's towards the end of Israel's history. Those are some of the darkest days of Israel's history because of that. And so the question here is a good question, and it addresses a hard-hitting issue that, like you said, I didn't have time to address, but it's definitely a good question. So I think the primary passage that addresses this is Isaiah chapter 10. Isaiah 10, at least in my Bible, has a heading that says Assyria is God's instrument. So in this passage, Isaiah the prophet is taking this poetic use of this term here, and he's saying that God is going to use the nation of Assyria to as a rod of his anger. That's verse 5, where he says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation and commission it against the people of my fury, to capture my booty and to seize plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets." So obviously God is upset with his people, with his nation of Israel, and he's telling the people through Isaiah that he's going to use Assyria as this rod of his anger or staff of indignation in order to trample them and humble them and bring them back to God, show them that God is still in control. So I think that the answer to the question is actually in the question itself. They ask, is slavery used by God to humble Israel? And I think that's exactly what Isaiah chapter 10 is teaching.
I wasn't able to get to exactly what this person, what else they might have been implying or asking this question, so I'll just try my best to do a follow-up for this person since they're not here. Does that create an ethical dilemma, in the fact that God would use evil nations like Persia and Babylon, who in fact, the prophet, it's slipping my mind, Habakkuk would say to God, these nations are more evil than Israel, and how can you use them to judge Israel? And Habakkuk asked that question in chapter 1. So what's your answer to this seeming ethical dilemma here?
Yeah, that's another good question. So it doesn't look to me as though God will cease all the consequences of our sin just because we are his people. And a good example of this that I like to use with people is the example of alcoholism, or whatever you want to call it. God condemns that practice over and over again in the New Testament especially. And yet, if I were to go out tonight and get drunk and do a bunch of terrible things, sin in all kinds of different ways, and uh, consequences were to arise because of those sins, God never promises me that those consequences will go away because I've chosen to partake of that particular sin. And I think that the same thing can be said of this sin in the Old Testament, where God's people had left His law, had left the Torah, and they had gone after other gods. And because of this, God had allowed them to be taken over by other nations. He told them that as long as they served Him, as long as they followed Him, they would be a nation of His people, a kingdom of God on earth. And He would protect them from other nations. He would help them to fight their battles. But when they left that practice of following God, then He allows the consequences to come as they may. And I think that's what we see there in Isaiah chapter 10.
Would it be fair then to say that if God, after he was done using Babylon as his rod of judgment, Isaiah 10, or Assyria, sorry, if he didn't then exact judgment on Assyria themselves, just for the same reasons that they did not recognize God and follow him, if he didn't exact judgment on Assyria, that would have then created perhaps an actual ethical dilemma. But in fact, he does do that, so that kind of reconciles that seeming problem. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think even if we might see evildoers in this lifetime go unpunished, we know that God's wrath against them will not go unsatisfied in eternity. That's one of the clear statements of the Bible, too. So even if to us it may seem like sometimes God lets the evildoers get away with everything and lets people who are trying to do good suffer, that seems to be one of the problems that the preacher addresses in Ecclesiastes. Even if we see that seeming contradiction here on earth, we know that in eternity and in God's ultimate.
So maybe they were going for does the ends justify the means? Maybe that was the question. I'm not sure, but anyways, appreciate your answer there, and we'll jump on now to question 2. So this one was a little bit perhaps broad of a question. You didn't touch on it exactly in your presentation, I don't think, that I could remember, but the question is, what about laws concerning foreign captives in the Old Testament? And maybe you can correct me, maybe you did touch on that.
Yeah, I chose not to touch on it too much because I felt like this was, of course, like you said, a broad topic, and I could have probably spent several hours talking about it if I wanted to. So I chose to talk primarily about Hebrew slaves, Israelite slaves, because I felt like those were where we could draw the most application for today. And this was a meeting where there was going to be a lot of young people, a lot of people who didn't quite know how to handle this issue. So I felt like the best way to handle it was to give a side of this issue that was very helpful, very reassuring to a person's faith, and able to draw a lot of application from it. In fact, I think the Apostle Paul, and I mentioned this in my sermon actually, in Ephesians, when he talks about slaves obeying their masters as in the Lord, or as to the Lord, and masters being respectful and kind to their slaves as well, because they realized that they too have a master in heaven. I mention that because that seems to reflect the ethics between a Hebrew slave and a Hebrew master in the Old Testament. So that was primarily why I chose to focus on Hebrew slaves. I think I mentioned just briefly that it was possible in the Old Testament for the Hebrews to have foreign captives, foreign slaves, but I didn't exactly address all of the laws that God had ordained for those sorts of situations. So I think the primary passage for that is actually in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and I'll be happy to address anybody else's questions. If you see me in person sometime and you have a question about this, I'd be glad to talk more about it. But Deuteronomy 20 is a sermon from Moses where they're getting ready to enter the land of Canaan. They're getting ready to have Joshua lead them on this great conquest through Canaan. And Moses, kind of the whole book of Deuteronomy, is a series of Moses' sermons to the people about what they should do when they get into the land. And he says in verse 9 and 10, he gives this ordinance about how they should handle taking slaves. Starting in verse 9, he says, "When the officers have finished speaking to the people, they shall appoint commanders of armies at the head of the people. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. So every time they went into a city, according to Moses, they were to ask and kind of offer peace to the nation or to the city. And if they accepted that peace offering, then they weren't to kill anybody. They were to go in and to take all of them as forced labor or as slaves. And then the other option was for them to decline the peace offering. And in that case, they were to go and to just lay waste. I think the version I read says besiege the city because the Lord God has given it into their hand. So those were the two options for the opposing army in the Old Testament. And this was given, it looks like, on several occasions in the book of Joshua to the cities. And some of them accepted and some of them did not. Some of them chose to fight and see if they could win this battle against God's army. So it looks like, at least in this case, the slavery option was the peace option. That was the option that was merciful on God's part, because in all actuality, he had given every city into their hands already. They just needed to go and take it over. So that's the first thing I think to note about foreign slavery, is that even if they had this option, even though they had this option, the contrast of the option on the other side of that coin was for them to be killed, for the whole army and nation to be killed, except for the women and children. So that's the first thing I think to get out of the way about foreign slavery, that it wasn't God just telling the people of Israel to go and to take slaves of all the nations and treat them awful. That's not at all what happened. In fact, it was the opposite of that. And then as far as this, like you said, it's a broad question. We could go in a lot of different ways. But as far as the treatment of slaves go, I don't see any evidence in the Bible that, in the Old Testament especially, that foreign slaves were treated any differently, except for one thing. There is one occasion when foreign slaves were to be treated slightly differently than Hebrew slaves. And I talked about this in my sermon, that every 6 years, the debts of the Hebrew slaves were to be canceled, and they were to be let go. And that happened especially on the year of Jubilee. But in the Old Testament, it never gives that command for foreign slaves, so they were not to be let go. They were not to be forgiven of their debts. And the reason they weren't to be let go, it looks like to me, is because they didn't have debts. They weren't the kind like Hebrew slaves who would sell themselves into slavery in order to avoid being poor. So they didn't have a debt to cancel, so therefore there was no reason to let them go. So that seems to be the reason for the difference between foreign slaves and domestic slaves being let go or not let go. And then the final passage that I think addresses one of the problems in this question is a passage I mentioned actually in the sermon. It's in Exodus chapter 21, where Moses is telling the people some laws about personal injuries and how they should handle being injured. He talks about what to do if your ox escapes and it gores someone or hurts someone, injures them. You're to, if it kills that person, you're to kill the ox. It's kind of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of idea. And the same thing if it happens to your slave. If your slave is hurt by this ox or by this bull or whatever, and he's killed, well, then the bull's to be killed too. And there's several other occasions here in chapter 21 that deal with similar instances where even two Israelites, get into a fight and they kill one another, or one of them kills another one or injures another one. They're to have that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of concept behind that penalty. But there's another place here in Exodus 21 where he deals with how to treat your slaves. Let's see if I can find it here. Right here in verse 26, he says, "If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth." And then he goes on to talk about the ox goring a man or woman to death. And then in verse 32, it talks about the ox goring a male or female slave. "If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned." And then he goes on to give several other instances of this kind of treatment here. And earlier on in the chapter, he makes a statement. I think it's in verses 12 through 17, if I'm correct about that. He makes a statement that if you are to strike your slave, and that slave dies on the spot, dies within the day, then you too are to be killed for that. It's an eye for an eye kind of concept, punishment concept. But if the slave is beaten or hit in some way, stricken in some way by their master, and they don't die for 2 days or so, then there should be no punishment for that on the master's part. So this brings up a few issues that I think relate to this law about concerning foreign captives in the Old Testament. The first thing to note is that this passage in Exodus 21 does not specify just a Hebrew slave or just a foreign slave. This was the blanket statement about slaves. Whether it was a foreign slave or a domestic slave, either one, they were to be treated fairly, they were to abide by these laws, and that's just the blanket statement of Exodus 21. Now, I think the most difficult passage here is the one I mentioned about a male or female slave being beaten by their master. And a lot of people, I think, get hung up on this, and they say, well, see, he says that if you actually kill them, then you have to be put to death too. But as long as you don't kill them, they're not. It's all fine and dandy, you know. That's kind of the idea that a lot of people walk away with. But I think we have to understand that this happened in a civil government context. This happened back when Israel was a physical nation. Obviously, we have spiritual Israel today as God's people on earth. But back then, when they had a physical nation of Israel, there had to be some delegation of justice, and that's the best way I can think to explain it. This happens throughout the Old Testament. We see examples of this where normal people, normal citizens of the nation of Israel, are given certain delegated authority over different areas of life. It could be over slaves, it could be over oxen, or it could be over other cattle, or maybe pieces of land, or other things that needed to be dealt with in the nation. And I think this is what we have here. Each master of a slave had the delegated authority to punish that slave if need be. Now, that still doesn't help us really understand why he should be punished if the slave dies within a day. But if the slave does not die within 2 days, then he doesn't have to be punished. That still kind of leaves it open-ended. And I'll jump ahead a little bit maybe and give a recommended reading on this. There were two scholars that I found to be very helpful in this passage, in studying this passage. And they're both actually Jews to this day. They're not Christian authors, they're Jewish authors. And they were both commenting on this passage here in Exodus 21. One of them was named Umberto Cassuto, who I know many people have heard of. He's a very famous Jewish scholar. He died not too long ago. I think actually before he finished his Exodus commentary, he passed away. And then the other man is a man named Nahum Sarna. Both of them have really good comments on this passage, and they both notice how the intent behind the striking is really the emphasis here. So if a master went up to their slave with the intent of killing them, then of course they would be dead within a day. That was if they didn't leave them dead. If they just beat them and then decided to leave them there, then it really wasn't for the intent of killing them. And that was, of course, punishable under Israelite law, the intent of killing someone, of murdering someone. But, on the other hand, if they went up to them simply to punish them and did not have the intent of really killing them, they just wanted to punish them for some act that they had committed, then they had that authority, that delegated authority from the civil government. And so they were given certain protections by the law to say if they went up to this slave, beat them or struck them in some way, but didn't kill them outright, weren't there to kill them, weren't there to commit homicide, but were just there to punish them, then there were certain protections for that. And the way you distinguish between those two intentions, one being the intention to kill them, and one being the intention just to punish them, is by how long the period between the beating and their death actually was. If it was instant, if it was within that day, then you knew for sure they went to kill this person, and that is punishable by Israelite law, by God's law. But if they simply went up to them to punish them, then of course they wouldn't die within that day. But it's possible some other maybe intervening illness or intervening disease or cause could come in and cause them to die within the next few days. And in that case, the Israelite master was protected because they weren't meaning to kill them. They were just meaning to punish them, and something else came along and intervened. So hopefully that's a little bit fuller explanation than I was able to give in the sermon about Exodus 21, and hopefully that answers a few questions about foreign slaves too.
Thanks. That was helpful. The Sarna and Kasunto were the two scholars. You said something in your lesson that I wanted to bring back up just for the sake of what you just talked about. You had mentioned how a lot of scholars have chosen to use the word servant as opposed to the word slave in many of these texts because the dynamic of what this relationship was between the master and the servant was very different, even for foreign captives, than the Confederate South's black chattel slavery that we're familiar with in our nation's history, right? I thought about that as you're going through when you talked about the punishing the slave, people's images probably go immediately back to some Frederick Douglass quote. And you're basically just stating the fact that just like you mentioned a family relation, maybe even within this dynamic of the servant living under the house of its master and so forth. And so just like a father might discipline his child, the master might discipline his servant because of some heinous act they had committed. Is that what you're kind of describing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I saw...
Ideally.
Yeah, that's right. And I saw a comment from someone, I don't know where it was, maybe it was somebody who texted me afterwards, but they asked why I kind of chose to use the term bondage or servanthood instead of slavery, when in all reality they mean pretty much the same thing. And I agree with that. If you look up in a dictionary, bondage, slavery, servanthood, serfdom, or whatever, a lot of them mean pretty much the same thing. So they asked why I chose to use bondage or servanthood instead of slavery. And that's primarily the reason why, is because when I say slavery in America, we have a certain concept that comes to our minds pretty much immediately. And it's not the concept at all that the Bible describes. So in order to kind of help people move away from that concept of what antebellum slavery looked like in the American South, especially, I tried to use different terms. Even though they may mean the same thing, it doesn't conjure up the same images. So hopefully that was helpful to people. If not, you can continue to use the term slavery. It's a fine term. It's a Bible term. So I just tried to help people see the difference between those two things.
I thought it was a great point. I think it's something very helpful because there is no doubt that if you do very much research, and you explain a little bit of it, the history of different types of slaveries or servitude dynamics within history. You talk about Roman slavery in your sermon. You talk about Greek slavery, Hebrew indentured servanthood, and you went through several different types. And I had heard those before. It doesn't take very long through history to discover those, but most people haven't looked even that far into history, and so they only know one picture of slavery, and it's a very cruel, inhumane, unethical, immoral practice, right? But also, to your point, this is very different because it was under a theocratic government where civil government and religious law were intertwined together. So I thought that was a very good distinction you brought up there. So yeah, I really was helped, at least myself, with the explanations you just gave. So I appreciate you offering those. And if anybody has any other questions, I'm sorry we will not be doing a part 2 Q&A. This will be the only Q&A that we do. But would you like to give people a couple of things? Maybe your email address. You don't have to. I'm putting you on the spot there, kind of. Maybe a way to contact you if they do have questions, and then furthermore, maybe some reading materials or video materials.
Yeah, the two commentaries that I mentioned a moment ago by Casuto and Sarna, they're spelled just like they sound. Those are really two very good commentaries on passages in Exodus, especially. And like I said, they're from Jewish sources, so they're not trying at all to prove anything Christian about them. They're just trying to explain the Hebrew text. So that's what makes them kind of insightful in that way. Again, a book that I mentioned in my sermon by Paul Copan called "Is God a Moral Monster?" That's a good book. It doesn't just address slavery; it addresses all kinds of issues. Other issues that were addressed in the meeting a few weeks ago are addressed in there, so that might be helpful. I talked to some of the other guys who spoke at the meeting, and they said they also were helped by that. So that's a good resource I would recommend. And then as far as asking me questions, you can email me. I can give you my email. It's actually just my name, Leonard Kaleb, and then a 0 at the end at gmail.com. So if you have any questions, you want to email me. I know many of you who are probably listening to this have my phone number, and if you want to get a hold of me that way, that's fine too. But if you have any questions, if you see me in person sometime and you want to ask a question, feel free. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Okay, man. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's it's a gift of time. So it takes some preparation to go into this, and we appreciate everything that you did in preparation for your presentation and also for this little Q&A segment. So good luck to you, Kaleb. We offer you God's blessings in your work for Jesus Christ and his kingdom, and we'll see you next time, Lord willing.
All right. Thank you.